Last year, Switzerland exported 5.6 times per capita what we did in the UK to member states of the EU. The fact of the matter is, you do not have to be in a political union in order to trade.
And I don't think, actually, that it was the case that the EU's position in that final end game was dictated by the slowest wagon in the EU caravan.
Is it good or bad that the UK is part of this negotiating bloc?
Good, I think. First, we have access to our home market, the single market, a market of 550 million consumers to whom we can sell our goods and services very easily. Second, taking the European Union as a basis, we're then able to negotiate very important agreements with other major trading partners. We've succeeded with South Korea, we've succeeded with Canada, we're on the way with the USA.
There's an argument that if we left the EU, we could just get on with this ourselves and become Hong Kong and just have individual arrangements with individual countries.
It's true, of course, that if we left the European Union, we would be free to negotiate agreements as an individual sovereign country. It's difficult to know exactly how that would work out.
Now, without us being a member of the EU, in my view, as those deals have been negotiated, there are a number that have been negotiated quite successfully, we would have had absolutely no clout to achieve those changes that we hope would be happening, so that actually our trade can flow freely.
Or would it be rather similar had we had the flexibility to be outside?
I think the interesting one for us is what would the UK-EU trade agreement be. I think when it came to manufactured goods, clearly we are in deficit. In fact, when you take out invisibles, we are in deficit. They sell more to us than we sell to them, if you like. The interesting thing is services, because we are a leader in services, and it's particularly financial services, the area that I've been focusing on in the last few years.
Some people would say it's better we come out of Europe and then this issue is resolved for us.
Well, I think when you're looking at it in terms of pure trade, I think one of the things we have to remember is that one of the biggest myths in trade is that countries trade with each other. It is not countries that trade with each other. It's people and businesses in one country who trade with people and businesses in another country for mutual benefit.
What about negotiating with growing economies like China and India? Is it an advantage there?
Well, it's interesting. A few years ago, a colleague of mine was in India, and the trade minister at the time said he would love to sign a UK-India trade agreement, but he knows he couldn't do it. But a couple of weeks later, another colleague said to me, the same trade minister said he would love to sign an EU-India trade agreement. So I think it depends on the reality of the world at that time.
The regulatory outcomes that we've managed to achieve in the living agreement we currently have isn't very good for Britain.
Well, I mean, there are, of course, you can, of course, cite examples where we feel that the regulatory balance inside Europe is not where we would want it to be. Does that trump the fact that British businesses ultimately still only have to deal with one set of regulation at the European level rather than 28? I'll defer to Vicky on that, but I suspect probably not.
Peter Mandelson, all the usual suspects, predicted that if Britain did not enter the euro, the City of London would lose its role as the world's #1 financial centre. And the usual suspects are saying the same, frankly, who've been proved demonstrably wrong before,
on this panel is
are
saying
now
this.
saying the same thing over again, should we leave the EU?
We're trying to keep this panel as a not to get into the
sloganising. But I'm entitled to mention as an academic point.
Sure, but of course you wouldn't have the same negotiations you have to go to in Brussels where you're putting Britain's interests within Europe, because that would be cleaner though, wouldn't it?
Well, perhaps, but again, look at how many people are involved in this. Of course, businesses have to go around and lobby Brussels, but otherwise they will have to go around and lobby every country in Europe.
And what about the view that trade is about individuals trading, it's not countries trading, so wouldn't this be better to be done just on an individual basis?
trade is partly individual based, but it isn't necessarily, because what's been going on right now, of course, is with a complete change in terms of production patterns, the supply chains become incredibly important. So, for example, we are worried here in the UK that we don't export enough to China, for example. Well, in reality we do, because what happens is we export loads of bits that go into, let's say, German manufacturing, which is then exported to the likes of China and the BRIC countries. Which means really that our trade is quite significant, but it's hidden by the way in which statistics are collected. So we're not really just one little country doing things directly with another country. We are part of this large production machine where we contribute to the bits that we are most competitive in, and other countries do the same in other parts of the manufacturing chain. So we are all interconnected, so you can't do it in isolation.
I thought there was an interesting point about having your own house in order in the EU. And during the financial crisis, Ireland obviously famously guaranteed bank deposits, which was against EU law at the time. And I just wonder what the panel's view is on, especially in financial services, national member states acting in a national interest.
As a trading bloc, not being able to even have a financial sector which operates across and finances trade properly, because basically trade finance has collapsed, is a big issue. And I think I agree that we need to get our own house in order, and that's a problem that we're going through right now.
Banks are international in life, but national in death.
But if we were out of the EU, would it not be an equally difficult problem to negotiate with everyone individually?
No. Switzerland, for example, has got a trade agreement with Japan. The EU doesn't. New Zealand has got a trade agreement with China. The EU doesn't, and is very unlikely to. Even Iceland has got a trade agreement with China. It's exactly the other way around.
A British diplomat, who's now a very senior British diplomat in the Foreign Office, once said to me, foreign policy would be great if it wasn't for the foreigners. And I think that actually brings us to the nub of the point, which is what we're talking about here is not just our ability to make unilateral decisions about how we want to manage our own economy, it's our weight in shaping those decisions in others.
I was just wondering, why did members of the panel think that certain figures within the EU are so reluctant to consider an EU-China free trade deal, whether or not this attitude is going to change?
Talking about EU trade agreements, and Dr. Kamal, I think, alluded to this earlier on, is that what the politicians do, who have much too much influence, is they try and tack on a lot of extraneous stuff onto trade agreements, which doesn't affect trade.
The regulatory outcomes that we've managed to achieve in the living agreement we currently have isn't very good for Britain.
I'm Ronald Stewart-Brown of the Trade Policy Research Centre. I'd just like to introduce a few new facts into this debate. If you look at UK exports of goods to the rest of the world, between 2007 and 2012, they've been growing at 9% per annum, compared to the EU at 3% per annum.
Now, I'm an unashamed open free trader, but there are people in my party who will say, I believe in free trade, but, and they will list a sector. And there are people in UKIP, for example, who claim to be unashamedly free traders, or they believe in open markets, and it's very interesting, free trade, but not free movement of people.
We've tried to keep on talking about some of the trade-offs this morning rather than the black and whites, and for quite a lot of the time we've succeeded, which I think is really, in this debate on this subject, quite an achievement.